Dr. Marcel Vogel. In 1977 and 1978, Vogel participated in experiments with the Markovitch-Tesla electrical power source, referred to as MTEPS, that was built by Peter T. Markovitch. He received 32 patents for his inventions up through his tenure at IBM. Among these was the magnetic coating for the 24-inch hard disk drive system still in use today. His areas of expertise, besides luminescence, were phosphor technology, magnetics, and liquid crystal systems. The video you're about to see is of Dr. Vogel examining a piece of metal given to him by Billy Meier. I, like many of you, realize Billy Meier has been classified as a hoax. However, this piece of evidence certainly cannot be disregarded after scientific evaluation from a man with the credentials just discussed. You will also be presented with, to keep things unbiased, the analysis of Dr. Ivan Alvarado regarding Dr. Vogel's examination of this metal. For the first time ever, you will get to see two different time periods of two different doctors giving you their evaluation, side by side, comparing the analysis graphs that they presented. And you will be the judge, finally, of what's real and what isn't.
In the extraterrestrial sense, we've been telling you about a Swiss man who was at contact with what he says are over 100 times with aliens from a place called Pleiades, which is a planet somewhere in our galaxy out there. And he's just published a book with all kinds of pictures and all kinds of texts about that contact he's had.
By a Swiss farmer named Billy Meier. Meier has hundreds of other photos and some metal fragments from the spaceship. The photos that are not in the current book are still being tested, and so are the metal fragments. Marcel Vogel, a research scientist with IBM, tells us about one piece of metal that he examined under an electron microscope.
It's a very unusual combination from a metallurgical standpoint. I've shown these to metallurgists, and they shake their heads. And the most unusual thing is the purity of these metals in adjacency to one another without their cross-contamination. They're very sensitive to light, and as soon as I expose them to intense light from my microscope, the metal oxidizes very rapidly and just breaks down. I've never seen that. This really took me back. That only happened on Friday. And then going back in tonight, I'm having another go at observing and measuring that.
Many of you, like myself, familiar with the Meier case, realize there are hundreds, if not thousands, of UFO photographs floating around the internet. However, I was unaware that Mr. Meier presented this scientist a piece of metal for him to analyze on camera live at the time. So hopefully this will be as interesting to you as it is to me.
Okay, Dr. Vogel, could you tell us about your background briefly?
I'm a senior scientist with IBM in the General Products Division laboratories at Monterey and Cottle Road. My work has been from earliest childhood in the study of the conversion of energy inside of crystals. I started at the age of 7 on the exploration of bioluminescence, of firefly, the light of the firefly, and by 11 I was synthesizing the chemical that made the firefly glow, the 3-aminophthalate-1,4-dione.
I believe we all can attest that at age 11 to be able to do that, this gentleman would certainly have above average intelligence. As an engineer myself, I can't even imagine achieving something like that at that age.
It's a chemical analog to that which is in the firefly. And from that point on, I've focused my life on the study of luminescence, the conversion of energy in crystals. The materials that are in your color television, that are fluorescent lamps, and built my own corporation in this, and then developed for IBM the magnetic disk coding memory system, which now IBM uses throughout the world in their disk memories. I've developed the coding. We hold the basic patents for this material, and I've been into the field of material science all of my life. for the past 20 years, since 1960, I've developed a skill in optical microscopy because I wanted to study liquid crystal systems. I said there would be a very important new discoveries made in liquid crystals. These will be useful in watches, display devices, and I proceeded to develop these materials.
The viewers of my channel really vary in age. Some of you were alive in the 70s. Some of you were not. I personally were. And that being said, I want to make you understand the gravity of what you just heard him explain when it comes to him starting a corporation and then achieving 30 patents. What you are talking about is virtually unheard of, let alone even today, especially considering this gentleman did not have social media to actually market what he was working with. So this was all internally done, mostly through word of mouth, and mostly through corporations that were really looking at the products he was actually inventing and designing. So when you think about that, think of the fact that not only is his credentials that is a doctorate, but we're also looking at a man who is an inventor / engineer who actually has a single patent that's still in use today. That holds an enormous, or should, amount of gravity for what is being explained here. They did not want to go to an average person in this field in terms of engineering or a background in looking at materials like this. They wanted a true expert at that time. But if we really think about it, he would be a true anomaly today as an engineer for the vast knowledge that this gentleman has.
For IBM. With that, I have put together probably the most complete optical microscopic gear, about almost $250,000 in optical microscopes.
To put that into perspective, in currency as of 2024, it would be $728,000.
And this brings us to the present point where I was contacted in April by Mr. Jim Delatosa, and they told me about this unusual sighting in Switzerland by Mr. Myers. I've had a rather negative feeling towards UFOs because I said, unless...
This 8mm footage, like many of Mr. Myers, is very interesting because we don't just have the UFO in the frame. We also have a vehicle you can see on the bottom of the screen. That allows for analytics to be done on this frame to see what the scale perspective is on the UFO in comparison to the vehicle. Now, I will not go into detail in this video as far as Billy Myers' incidents with these type of photos and this type of footage. You can do your own homework there. I will say this, there has been numerous analytics done on his photographs that have reflected correct scale in that the actual image of the craft, or whatever craft is present, is correct with the images in the background. So whether it be a tree, whether it be him himself, there's tons of footage of him. This cannot be denied.
I have something physical that I can get my hands on. Just reported sightings and things like that have no interest to me. And from a human interest standpoint, I said, fine, I'll see what I can do to investigate these specimens that were left by these contacts. And so Mr. Delatosa contacted Mr. Stevens, and he wrote to me the letter and sent me 3 specimens.
And did you analyze all?
Yes, I did. If you want, now I can show you some of the results that we got with the first specimen that was given to us. It is silvery, as you can see, in color.
I do apologize. There are some dark spots here, but keep in mind the technology of that time was not that great. I did upscale this slightly to give us a little more resolution. I did not want to manipulate anything to any degree. I wanted the color spectrum to be the same. There has been some color remastering to bring everything into perspective, but other than that, this is exactly what he found when he did the analysis on the original piece of metal.
It looks like it has been melted. This is the raw specimen which was mounted in plastic, lapped and polished in Switzerland. And now you can see this metal in its pristine state. It is remarkable. We will now illuminate it by oblique illumination. It has many facets of color to it. Taking out the analyzer to bring out some more of the metallic sheen and luster to it. As one goes to higher magnifications on this specimen, one will see other fascinating details. This type of research takes many hours to fully exemplify. We'll look at the backside of this specimen now. This is the backside of the specimen, and under cross-field polarized light, one does see these white crystalline birefringent deposits. The luminous area to the right is just a reflective glare from the light source, as one can see here, but we're dealing now with polarized light, and there is this area illuminated. One side is highly metallic, the other has some forms of crystalline occlusions attached to it. I'm using no objective lens in the Zeiss Ultrafo 3B, and am using what is called a pH position, bringing in a Bertrand lens, and I'm focusing with the Bertrand lens to bring out the details. Gives me the lowest power in the microscope, so I can bring the specimen totally into the field of view that one is seeing here. It's a very small but highly convoluted specimen, so it...
Of course, the imaging that we're seeing appears either blurry or somewhat like it's underwater, and a lot of this is because of the power of the microscope. I am going to put on screen here what the pieces of metal actually look like as they're much higher resolution, and once again it just gives you a better feel of exactly what this gentleman was working with.
It takes many forms of light. The cesium iodide, 2 incandescent bulbs on the left and the right hand side. Now we'll move to a higher level of magnification of this and see what we will find. We're looking at this specimen now with Nomarski interference contrast. The objective is a 8x pole, so we're between 80 and 120 diameters magnification.
As we go through the video, you guys are going to notice that there are some dark spots, and rather than make you just listen to the doctor giving his analyzation and not actually seeing a video, I'll put up excerpts from the 1985 documentary so you guys can at least review those while listening to the doctor. And then, of course, as we get more images in place that are actually visible, I'll let the documentary continue on the analyzation of the metal.
Under interference contrast, one sees now a vein of highly birefringent material running through the specimen we did not see before. What I'm pointing out is that to see the details in this specimen requires an extensive use of all the tools of microscopy. Now we can see banded structures in the center of the field, like full lines as one would encounter in lava-like flows. The material looks like it has been extended in a flow process, but it does not show what one would see in a furnace from extensive heating. The remark has been made that this specimen was made by a cold flow process. And
the footage you're about to see is some of the most interesting in this case, in my personal opinion. Billy takes it upon himself to set up a camera. He then allows the audience to see him in the scene with the beam ship, allowing for depth perception because we see the beam ship over the mountainside. We see Billy sitting on the mountain. And not only is he sitting on the mountain, he becomes sort of an active participant where he's able to move his hands and move around, so much so he actually gets up, walks back towards the camera to retrieve what he's just filmed. Really, really fascinating stuff, regardless of if it's real or a hoax. If you look closely, you can see the tree move as the craft flies over it.
Of structure which are highly birefringent, as one sees in here, very distinct lines. Here is a complete pattern of material flowing in and precisely stopping. Here one can see a better detailing of this. It's like a material has been kneaded and rolled over and flowed together. Here's another band. There you can see a good view of the structure now on the surface. I'm putting the analyzer in, rotating it. We'll go now from the quartz iodide lamp that we're using here.
It's really interesting. Dr. Vogel really can't tell that this could be just a random piece of metal, a piece of aluminum, a piece of steel, cobalt. We don't know. But you would have thought that someone with his background would be able to identify it pretty easily had this been, just a random piece of metal, or once again, there's some trickery going on.
100 watt to 250 watt cesium iodide. Much more detail is evident, and one gets better penetration of the light into the sample. Coming back. We're conscious of it, but now we can clearly see it. I will examine this specimen later on with infrared and ultraviolet microscopy to look for further detailing. This is pure exploration, because one does not know what one is dealing with at this time. We'll go to one more level of magnification. We'll go to a higher magnification in this particular area and see what we will see. Here is the same area now at 160 diameters, and one can clearly see distinct areas between in the specimen. If one were to use gross examination of this specimen, one would lose the significance of these discrete areas. In the analysis we will do now, we will take each one of these areas and examine them in detail. Go to a higher level light source. Suddenly these things come out.
It almost appears that there's like a holographic effect where the crystals are actually part of the metal.
Adjusting the aperture diaphragm. There's the edge of the diaphragm. Quite difficult in area. We'll move around a bit. And little tiny crystallites. These banding are fascinating. Here it is here. There we are. What I'm trying to visualize is how this thing is put together. There are discrete bands of material you saw in the lower power, and they look like they've been manipulated instead of made by nature. With this now, we will conclude with this specimen.
Just to clarify for everyone to be on the same page, they did submit multiple types of samples to Dr. Vogel to analyze.
We're now looking at a silvery metal specimen number 5 in the 4th stage of development that is used according to the document that was given to me in the preparation of the metal for a spacecraft. We're looking at the object now, which has been mounted and polished under cross-field polarized light using a 250-watt cesium iodide light source. There is birefringent areas in the middle of the picture, and as we rotate the analyzer, we'll see the specimen of the metal appear here. It is rather complete in the sense that there are no precise differences in grain boundaries. There are occlusions in the material which are quite birefringent, especially around the edge of the metal.
It's amazing that over 40 years ago they were able to still record under some type of detail something as small and as intricate as this. It would be so amazing to have the clarity of our cameras and optics today to see this same piece of metal.
One rotates the analyzer now, one can see these strongly birefringent areas. There's a thin skin of a crystalline-like material, highly birefringent, white as one can see here, and the metal itself has minute specks of also birefringent material in it. These must now be analyzed by the scanning electron microscope. We're dealing with a rather low magnification. In this case, it is the 6.3 X-pole, so we're about 100 diameters. We'll go now to higher magnification. We're now at 1,600 diameter magnification, and now a whole new world appears in this specimen under polarized light, cross field. There are structures within structures that one sees, very, very unusual, and which now bear investigation. At lower magnifications and without oil, one just sees a metallic surface. Now one sees a structure which is composed of various type of interlacing areas. By the use of television, we can get a isodensitric value showing these areas, and as I rotate the analyzer, we overload the Vidicon to see these areas.
This is where I wish I had more knowledge in this field, but that's why I'm putting the definitions on the screen, because I feel it helps us all understand more of what the doctor's talking about.
These areas start to evolve. Here they are now by use of the Vidicon tube. Here they are being brought out. These are structures within structures. This is very exciting, very interesting, and bears looking into. This is the polished specimen. We're at crossfield. We're using the 250-watt xenon and cesium iodide source. We go to higher magnification yet, and higher yet. We're now at over 2,500. And one can see these birefringent structures. Very exciting And we must go now to the scanning electron microscope. This is very unusual for a metal to have these birefringent areas. A metal.
I can't help but wonder what amount of money it would take for a man with such a distinguished background to ruin his entire career to commit a hoax. And if anyone does know of any money that was taken by this gentleman, I've never found any articles on that, if he actually took a payout or something. I would love to see it. But really, you have to think about that. What amount of money would it take for you to ruin your career? I mean, ruin everything that you've left in a legacy. And once again, as distinguished as over 30 patents, I mean, this guy has got some background.
Normally will not exhibit this. The birefringent areas are the white portions and the deep bluish areas that we're seeing on the color screen. I'll expand this. Now we'll move on to other specimens. We'll scan for a moment. The edge again. This is the edge. It's the highest magnification one can go now in the optical system. And from here we must now go to the scanning electron microscope. This is the letter that was sent to me by Mr. Wendell Stevens.
Just to bring everybody up to speed on who's watching this, because I know there might be multiple generations where they haven't done as much research on this older case. Again, this is a really old case. It's got a lot of history to it. This person Dr. Vogel is speaking about is Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens. Now, you guys can check him out yourself. He's got a lot of history. I mean, things of dealing with the CIA, and I mean, it gets kind of crazy. And rather than sway off topic, I really want to stay on point with this. So if you're interested in him, definitely do your own research.
And I indexed each of the type of specimens with a code number. The photomicrograph under low power is shown here of the specimen, and I've taken and given to each discrete area a index number. Magnification is 8 diameters. The physical specimen was almost identical in dimension to what you are seeing here. Very much alike. This is another specimen. Now, we took under polarized light and examined. This is under just reflected light.
I think we would all be in an agreement that this is an inordinate amount of detail for this to be a hoax. And I'm certainly not saying it isn't. I am, however, saying that in all of the cases that I've reviewed, all of the cases I ask you to review online, we know that 95, 96, maybe even 97% are fake. This case is one of the oldest in history. And to have witnesses, along with the documents we see presented here, this gentleman's background, the man himself, Mr. Meyer, has had 23 assassination attempts recorded on his life. Whether or not that's true, of course, I don't know. But I'm going to say that at what point, logically, would someone say there's enough evidence to say something is there? Whether it's 100% accurate, I certainly don't believe that. But I do think it's fair as a rational person to say something is there. We know physical pictures, especially by today's standard, not necessarily back then, can easily be manipulated.
Coming in at an oblique angle. Very interesting thing is the goldish area here, there's silvery, but also these peculiar flow lines coming. I then went and used Nomarski interference contrast microscopy, and we came across now crystalline patterns, which are in here. And again, you notice these flow lines, like a material being melted and pulled out like taffy. This is very unusual to see a metal specimen exhibiting these type of both composite crystalline patterns and metallic luster of a piece of metal. But even more interesting, I start to go now into this area here, then using what we call polarized light. We polarize light and going to a little higher magnification, only 63 diameters. We got to highly birefringent areas. These colors are caused by the optical rotation of your light, giving you these intense colors, which we call birefringence. And circular areas, little deposits of crystalline formations in these circular areas. Now, I decided to go,
Now Dr. Vogel understands that he's dealing with a composite, and that's when he decided to change his strategy and move to his electron microscope made by Hitachi. Now, of course, we all know their technology back then is nowhere near our technology today, but it does show that once again, the amount of resources he had available at the time to once again analyze the metal is very impressive.
Saw that it was what I call a composite. Means it is composed of a varying grouping of materials. I had to go to a discrete form of analysis, not just general analysis or even cutting a piece out, but I had to leave the specimen alone and study it piece by piece. And that was done with the Hitachi scanning electron microscope. I work now with an associate of mine, Dr. Wee, and this is now a scanning electron micrograph of A1 area, and this is A2. This is 500 diameters. This is now this area here blown up to 2,000 diameters. This is a field emission microscope, so one gets then very, very high degree of depth of field. The specimen was not touched, which means I did no gold plating, no metallization of the surface, so it was left alone. And what excited me was a tremendous ability to get a depth of field in the specimen without ion burning. In other words, the electron beam did not accumulate.
This is one of those minute details that really has to be taken in slowly, especially if you're not familiar with these processes. I certainly wasn't. I did a lot of research on this to make sure I really have the understanding of what this doctor is talking about. Apparently, when using an electron microscope, testing samples, you'd apply that gold plating so you have a conductive surface. And in this case, the sample actually was conductive by itself, and it was able to allow the electron microscope to show all that delineation in that picture.
These surfaces acted as conductors here and gave us then a very sharp, clear delineation of the picture. Normally you have to take and cover this with gold, to get a sharp picture. This specimen is called number 4, same metal as the sample that turned to powder, dark third process. The silver is the 4th process and the gold silver is the 5th. The preliminary identification of this is copper, nickel, and silver. Silver solder, which is used for many forms of welding, is a combination of silver and nickel. Now the specimen that I'm talking about is right here, and this is the specimen that we're talking about, right here. The other lines that one see are the fracture lines from the embedment material and the cracking that took place.
The sample's gold color is really interesting considering we have silver, copper, and nickel, and then we do have traces of silver solder. Now, as an engineer, I've used silver solder myself many times. You could do aluminum welding with it. It's very interesting, and to see just that bright color, not only is it beautiful, it just really draws that question even more, how are we formulating these bright colors?
We'll go into polarizing the light. And now one gets a lot of the glare away, and one can see this specimen is dark, but there are again I call your attention to these lines, these vertical lines. Now we're going to look into that center part, that whitish area, and this line. We'll increase the magnification and see. We're now viewing at Nomarski interference contrast at around 50 diameters. We see these highly birefringent lines, flow process, and again, a series of vertical lines. We'll go to now polarized.
Now I realize this image is dark. Once he switches over to the polarized light, it'll brighten up slightly. There is no way to really edit out or enhance this image to bring it up. So I'm trying not to edit the footage as much as possible to present you guys, the audience, a much better, clear documentary as far as this footage. There's many of you who may not have ever seen this. I had to search for it high and low because I have never seen it. And once again, I wanted to present you as much of the doctor's analyzation of the original footage as possible.
Slide and see what further detail. Here's some other areas. This is the boundary of this small particle. To give you an idea of dimension, we'll put a scale in to appreciate the dimension of this sample. These two lines here represent 1 millimeter, 1 thousandth, 1 millionth of a meter. And as one takes this away, one sees the specimen below. It's not very big. Again, these whitish areas around the specimen, showing that there was an interaction taking place between the plastic and the material. We'll go now to a higher magnification and polarized light. We're now looking at the specimen at 63x with a pole objective. The analyzer is out. One can see a small speck of the material. It's blackish in color, and because of the light now it has, now we polarize the light. There's the extinction position, and one can see there is a structure as I rotate the analyzer slightly. It's tied in there. We'll move in different areas. Here's the edge. Here's a reaction from the edge of the specimen forming highly birefringent material. Again, these spots, which we see before, here is a complete distinct area. Pull the analyzer around. We're in the metal. There we see it. This is the boundary of the plastic.
We've come to another dark spot of the video, and I just want to bring up one of those minute details again to your attention and really make you think about this. He's talking about seeing edges of plastic integrated into these metal samples. Now, if we look at the image again, and I'll bring it up on screen because I've displayed it earlier in the video, these samples look like pieces of metal. There's no apparent plastic present. It looks like a piece of gold or a piece of silver, and that's it. But when he's bringing up that there's integration of plastic in the metal itself, I find that really interesting, like I'm sure many of you do.
We're into the metal area here. This is number 4. This is the boundary in the plastic. Rotate the analyzer. We can bring it out. Here we are. There are 2 distinct areas here. These are the marks in the center of the picture again for Vickers hardness measurements. You can just see them. These were done in Switzerland. This will be reported.
Now we're at the portion of the documentary that I feel is most critical, as this is the portion of the video that is most analyzed by people claiming that this is a hoax. So to present this fairly, I want to do things differently. I want you guys to see not only the doctor's results, but also Dr. Ivan Alvarado, and I'll go into his background shortly, his presentation of the graph that you're about to see, where he claims he was able to create a similar result doing a sample that he's made up. Now, of course, he did not have the metal sample that Dr. Vogel did, but I'll let you see the direct examples presented by both doctors, and then you guys can be the judge of what you feel you're seeing is either real or fake based on the results that Dr. Alvarado got versus what Dr. Vogel got.
On separately. In this crystalline area, the predominant element was silicon, which is this band here, and iron, and there was a secondary band of sulfur, which is right here. These were very, very intense bands, and we did not attempt to go through the analysis of all the other particular lines that were present. We just took the three main ones and we stopped there.
Now you're about to see an excerpt from 2012, shot in Las Vegas, of Dr. Ivan Alvarado presenting the audience of TAM, which is known as That Amazing Meeting, and he is going to present his sample findings of trying to recreate what Dr. Vogel just presented to us in that bar graph of the analysis he performed. Just a bit of background on Dr. Alvarado. He was hired by Independent Investigations Group. Now they are basically the James Randi Foundation, who offer $500,000 to anyone who can prove to them that the paranormal exists. Now, this foundation was founded by James Randi, who was a famous magician, and apparently Mr. Randi wanted to prove that anybody claiming the paranormal existed, he would offer them under testing conditions. I'm not sure what those conditions are, but I'm sure they will go into full detail if you contact them, and they will offer you to sit with these people, prove whatever you're claiming, and if you do prove what you're claiming, at least to them being unbiased to that proof, they will present you with a $500,000 check or cash or however that works. Again, very, very interesting. Let's see what Dr. Alvarado has come up with.
It's a citizen of Switzerland, and for 40 years he's been claimed that he's been in contact with extraterrestrial beings, intelligent extraterrestrial beings, and continues and all that. Photographs, videos, sounds recordings, and metal samples were submitted by him as evidence of his contact. And most of this evidence has already been reproduced repeatedly and many times, particularly the photographs and the video recordings.
Okay, so there has to be a bit of fact checking done here. Dr. Alvarado said that the video recordings have been reproduced many times along with the photographs. Now, I will say this, he's absolutely right. The photographs have been reproduced, and like any story, the truth of the matter is the older the story is, regardless if it's paranormal or any story, you're going to have things change. The thing that makes the Meyer case, I feel, so interesting, and this is my own personal opinion, is the amount of evidence and the amount of people involved. The more evidence, the more people we have involved, the more this story becomes more grand. We know also the double-edged sword to that is the more people involved and the more evidence submitted to these people, the more potential for them to manipulate this evidence. So while he is correct that photographs have been reproduced, Dr. Alvarado, I would ask you personally to submit any video that has been reproduced in the Meyer case, because it is not online, sir.
The one part that has not so far been properly explained or reproduced are the famous or infamous metal samples. And those metal samples were sent to a scientist in in IBM labs at a time. His name was Marcel Vogel, and he went ahead and did some investigations on it, some analysis using fairly sophisticated equipment, and then he found some extraordinary properties that, in his own words, could not be explained, or something that he's never seen before, and so on and so forth. So at this moment now we have some sort of scientific endorsement of a very, very extraordinary claim of having really evidence of intelligence life or contact with intelligent beings from outer space. Now, why is this important? So, like I said, the samples are claimed to be actual physical evidence.
I, like many of you, wonder why someone with Dr. Alvarado's background deems it necessary to provide bullet points of why this sample is important to his audience. I mean, it would only be the largest discovery of mankind if this sample is indeed a fragment of a spaceship.
Evidence of contact with intelligent extraterrestrial beings, right? So, and a lot of, for somebody who believes in those things, if a scientist comes up and says that, yes, it is true, that's all they need. So it adds the credibility to the case quite significantly. Of course, the skeptics at the time, they mainly concentrated on questioning the credentials of the scientists and running around on that particular case instead of just going ahead and just, let's do a little search of the data that was produced that validates the claim, right? So that's one thing that it was, to my knowledge, has not been properly done in the last 30 years. I mean, this work was done in the early 80s by Mr. Vogel. And so far, I mean, all the information has been there, and nobody has really bothered to take a look at it. Now, thanks to YouTube, now it's pretty easy to find. So that's a good thing. And I think the most important thing of all is that a scientist uses his credentials, and not just his credentials, his access to fairly sophisticated and expensive equipment to go ahead and perpetrate a deception or deceive the general public.
This is very interesting what Dr. Alvarado is stating. He claims that Dr. Vogel was using his credentials and special equipment to deceive the general public. But sir, there's no proof of that, and you haven't really provided anything except an accusation. Because a man of your caliber, in terms of intelligence, would have provided some type of financial motivational proof, maybe a receipt, a check stub, something of that time to show that whoever was funding this documentary would have paid Dr. Vogel off to deceive using his credentials along with the special equipment he had access to. The other missing detail here that's not discussed, which I'm really shocked at, is the fact that Dr. Alvarado missed the document that had NASA's logo on it. So was that document also falsified? Because it did have NASA's logo on it. Maybe the documentary crew formulated that at the time and counterfeit, and produced this so that it would actually be shown in the documentary. I don't know. Like I said, I'm completely unbiased. Whether this is real or not, we should know the facts. And the facts are, I do not like when we point fingers and we really don't have any proof. Dr. Alvarado should know that Marcel Vogel died in 1991. So, of course, there's no way this gentleman can defend himself. But there are other things here that this gentleman is overlooking. The 23 assassination attempts, he never put that in any of the details either, on why Billy Meyer, a guy who is being claimed to be a hoax by the company that is employing this gentleman, would be killed. Where has that ever been the case? We've never seen that or heard about that, at least anywhere. I mean, Bob Lazar came out and was working at S4, claims to be, and they tried to kill him, but once, maybe twice, this man has gotten 23 assassination attempts.
With some extraordinary claims. All right. So here are some of the things he claims he found, the scientist, Mr. Vogel. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about him I mean, I don't know about his intentions at the time, and I'm not going to speculate on that one.
I'm sure you guys caught this because I can't believe what I'm hearing. He just stated previously with bullet point presentation that Dr. Vogel was using his scientific credentials and access to special equipment to deceive the public. Now he's saying that he won't speculate on what Dr. Vogel was thinking at the time when he presented his analysis. What does that mean, sir? You've just literally contradicted everything you just said right now. We just heard it. We can play it back and go side by side. Once again, this is interesting. I don't understand it, but it's interesting.
All I'm going to do is to concentrate on his actual data, and that's all. So if he had some other intentions to do this, or if he made a mistake, that I don't know, and I don't think I'm interested in that either. So one of the things he says is that, well, I have a sample, and it contains an unusually large number of elements of the periodic table. So just think about this for a second, right? I have a sample, and I probably have a sample here myself. Right. And I said, guys, I know that this has a lot of elements in the periodic table, more than I have ever seen in a solid state thing, right? So what could possibly make him think that, right? So that is the question that I asked myself, and we're going to go over the data that says that. Now, the other claim that he had set forth was an extremely rare element called thulium was found. And it was found in a way that it suggests that this whole thing was put together by unknown means. So I have something in my hand, and I say, I don't know how it was put together. I have no idea. It was given to me by somebody, and I'm looking at it, and I'm using all this equipment, and I don't know how this is put together.
Once again, the doctor is bringing up bullet points, and right now you have not seen the rest of Dr. Vogel's analysis, where he is discussing what elements make up the sample in greater detail. You'll see that as we go through, and you'll once again be able to make the direct comparison of what you're hearing Dr. Alvarado state, as well as seeing what Dr. Vogel is talking about.
It's strange to me. Right. And he goes on with many other claims. I mean, he goes on and on and on with some other stuff that I probably don't have time to cover. And it continues on with the same thing, like, this is so extraordinary, this is so great. Now, this is a scientist with 30 patents. And it's true he had 30 patents. And working for a very well-renowned IBM laboratories with access to all equipment, going around and saying that he just cannot explain what he's looking at. Right, so now all this, my sources are in our website that you can see over there in the IAG website. And we ourselves in the IAG had some time investigating Billy Meyer. And just last year we were challenged by some of the believers in saying that we have not covered these metal samples properly, right? Forget about all the photographs and the sound recordings, those are fine. You got us on that one. But not the metal samples. You guys can't figure that one out, right? So, well, this is the answer to that particular complaint.
I, like you, are really looking forward to what his definitive answer is of the complaint of all the believers of Billy Meyer, so we all can see and put this to rest. And I will, once again, I'll state the obvious, that this was all complete hoax.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about physics here, right? So the claim is that the alloy sample contains an unusually large number of elements of the periodic table, and he shows this graph over there that you can see on your screen on the left side. Now, what is this? This is an EDS spectrum. And now EDS, as is explained down there, is a technique used in scanning electron microscopy to determine elemental composition of a sample. And the way it works is you have an electron beam, and then you shine it on your sample, or you send it on your sample, and then it produces X-rays. And then you analyze the spectrum of those X-rays, and that way you can tell what elements you have in your particular sample, right? Now, so he shows this plot. Now, this plot, as you can see, is looks like a bell curve right there, and it has a lot of points. And he says, look at all the wide range of elements that I have, right from over there. And that is my evidence that there is an unusually large number of elements of the periodic table. Now, just real quick, if you don't understand this very well, it doesn't matter, because we have reproduced or made some counter examples to this so that you can tell that this can be produced by some other means, which is my next slide. So what I did is I said, well, I'm going to find a way of producing the same plot using a sample that contains only one element. If I can do that, then I just invalidated the claim that this can only be produced by a large number of elements in the periodic table.
I think it's safe to say that we would all be in agreement that if he could take one element and get the same results as Dr. Vogel with the analysis on the EDS, then we would all say that he's absolutely correct. And once again, we'll confirm it's a hoax.
So now on your left side, you have the original spectrum, and then on the right, on your right side, you have a spectrum that I took myself out of a sample of ultra pure nickel. Right? So this sample only contains one element, and I produced just about the same spectrum.
Now, I will openly admit I have absolutely no experience whatsoever with what Dr. Vogel and Dr. Alvarado are talking about as far as doing their analysis on these metal samples. That being said, my eyes work. Your eyes work. That graph that Dr. Alvarado just presented, doing pure nickel as the single element he's claiming is just about what Dr. Vogel presented, just about, sir, is not the same. And this is vastly different than what Dr. Vogel presented. And I'm stating this, and I think the audience that I have will look at this and objectively say, because I'm sure everyone in the audience, who cares if it's a hoax? Who cares if it's real? What do we have to benefit from it? If it is fake, we want to end the story and leave it at that. But now we have technology where we have cameras everywhere. And like you presented, Dr. Alvarado, YouTube has everything. Well, YouTube has some information. I think, though, presenting it in the way I'm doing it now and letting people be their own judge, seeing accurate information of what's unedited as far as the footage Dr. Vogel presented and then unedited footage of what Dr. Alvarado just presented, we all then can look at both in direct comparison and make the judgment with our own eyes in a way that allows everybody to decide, is this real or is it fake? And the only thing that we're deciding is real is the fact that Dr. Vogel's sample of whatever it was is definitely different than what's being presented by Dr. Alvarado analyzing pure nickel. I think we would be in agreement of that. Now we have Dr. Alvarado's analysis of the sample, and we'll continue with Dr. Vogel's.
We moved to another section, and I will come back here to this area. And now we were going into this plane right in this region. And we found evidence of what looks like mechanical manipulation. One sees now discrete marks in a diagonal form in this direction and marks in this direction. But what is exciting, it looks like it's been plowed. In other words, a pressure, and there is a scarfing on either side. And you see the regular spacings of these. And I was just working a space group out here, and they're very regular. We did an analysis of this area here. Now we're at 500 diameters. The elements that we found were totally surprising. The major element, which is shown here, was the rare earth metal thulmium, Thulium. It was totally unexpected, with a very small trace down here of bromine. This minute bump down here was a combination of argon and silver.
Now we'll go back to Dr. Alvarado's analysis of him trying to replicate what Dr. Vogel found in the original sample.
The element thulium. Right now, thulium, for those who know, is a rare earth element down in the periodic table. It's true, it's rather expensive to get, but it's not uncommon. It exists, and we've used it for many, many decades at this moment. But the best part of it is to say, look, this is not just thulium. It's got some bands missing. Now, on on the slide. So you can see this is an actual EDS spectrum of the element thulium. And this is the one that he produced as evidence. Now I'm going to say something real quick. This is actually a screenshot from YouTube. So this is as good as I could get it. But you can see that the computer is actually identifying thulium right over there. There is a TM. And this is how the system works. You produce your graph, and then the computer tells you what it is, right? So we have, for example, here silver, right, and thulium, and some other elements that are not relevant for this talk. And that doesn't mean the elements are actually there. That only means that this is what the computer thinks is there.
All right, so apparently we're getting into a bit of word salad right now. Dr. Vogel used an instrument, that computer, to once again spit out the EDS analysis of the sample and what elements were present within it. Dr. Alvarado is stating that just because you used a computer doesn't mean that the sample has what elements it states it does. What? Okay, if that's the case, Dr. Alvarado, why would you continue to use the same instrument? If it's all based on personal interpretation, then the instrument would have absolutely no use logically. So something here doesn't make sense, and it should be drawing your attention, especially in the engineering field, and I can speak of this. We always try to eliminate variables to keep things the same. If we're truly in it for science, it's not about what's real and what isn't. It's about what we're seeing and how much we can simulate keeping things accurate. And why I say that is we have a vast disparity in years separation between one sample that was actually taken and actually diagnosed to a guy trying to replicate that sample. But when he says that the tool being used to actually test and try to replicate the sample is just based on interpretation of using it, well, that changes everything. Because that's no different.
Right. So the computer sign indicates thulium, right? And there are some band missing. Now, as you can see, this is the actual EDS spectrum of thulium. There should be some bands around here, which they're not present on this one. So Vogel goes ahead and thinks, well, there are no bands over here, so this thulium is weird. This thulium has been stripped off from the inner electron shell somehow. Now that's the explanation for this. It says, this is weird, right? I've never seen anything like this before. The electron shells, the inner electron shells have been stripped off completely.
I don't know about you guys, but listening to what Dr. Vogel stated about the sample and the way he's describing it, I believe it's fair to say we would all be in agreement. He sounds like a validated scientist. He sounds like he's looking at a sample. He's certainly not ultra impressed or making just outrageous claims. He was presented with the sample and he's analyzing it. That's what I feel. And he's doing it in a very scientific fashion. The lingo he's using is scientific. He's not trying to persuade an audience like, oh my God, you've got to see this, it's extraterrestrial. We're not seeing any of that. Matter of fact, he sounds genuinely impressed by what he's looking at, but on a scale of 1 to 10, he's probably at a level 2 or 3. Yet we have Dr. Alvarado, who once again is kind of berating what this scientist is actually looking at. And I find that really strange, and I'll tell you why. Because if we look at Dr. Vogel's background, just looking at the man's background, this man had over 30 patents. I mean, he was highly recognized in his field. And this was 30 years prior to the technology that Dr. Alvarado had in 2012, which in my eyes leads me to believe that this man was on a totally different intelligence scale. And I'm not saying Dr. Alvarado isn't a smart man. I'm saying that we have to give a lot of credit to people who didn't have social media, didn't have the internet, and were able to achieve such a high standing in their career status. That's something that cannot be overlooked and shouldn't be overlooked. But when we hear a man who's obviously got a bias, because a true man of science in my eyes would not go back and make it to where we're pointing a finger and laughing at this gentleman. It would be more like, here's what I found, and yes, it differs from what he found. That's not what we're getting here. And I think many of you see the context in which he's describing things. You can even see the reaction of the audience that paid to go and see him. It's very interesting because I would have thought this foundation that James Randi has is really based on science. This is a scientific finding possibly, and something that should be taken very serious and not be a pissing match of, hey, I'm smarter than him or I know this equipment better than him. No, it should be more, hey, this is possibly the biggest scientific discovery of mankind, and I'm going to look at this very carefully and see if I can replicate what this gentleman found, and I'm not going to berate his history because I've never even met the man, number one. And number two, personally, his history far exceeds Dr. Alvarado's.
And this only suggests one thing. Cold fusion, ashless cold fusion technology. Unheard of in this planet. I mean, nobody has ever done this before. This is incredible. This is strange. I mean, this definitely suggests advanced technology. Well, for anybody who does EDS like I do all the time, you know that you cannot trust the computer too much. That's just the way it is. So I went ahead and looked at, well, what is this line coming from? So I looked in the periodic table and said, well, there may be a different element you're looking at here. So here we go. So I went ahead and did it myself. So I took a piece of aluminum and I just dropped a little bit of silver on it and put it in my system. And I got just about the same graph.
Well, now it's become openly apparent that Dr. Alvarado does have a bias. And the reason I'm saying this is he is not disclosing all of the details that are critical for his audience to be a judge in an unbiased format of a man of science. Let me explain. Dr. Alvarado just stated that he was able to achieve just about the sample that Dr. Vogel did from 30 years ago. But what you didn't say, sir, is that you were able to achieve just about that sample using equipment that was 30 years superior to what Dr. Vogel had. And just to clarify, you'll see that later in the video, where once again, he never openly says that to these people in the audience. No, he puts it on the screen in text. And of course, being people's normal attention span and detail rating isn't there what it should be because he's talking the entire time, keeping their attention focused on his voice, rather than them actually being pointed to direction to read that he's using equipment that's 30 years superior. Well, sir, the best analogy to that would be that you weren't able to achieve an exact sample replica of what Dr. Vogel did 30 years prior using inferior equipment in a comparison that you would essentially be using an iPhone versus a guy with a flip phone, and you couldn't take a picture that superiorly beat his flip phone. That's essentially what you're saying. And what's really funny is that you explain this to your audience with some sort of professional arrogance in that they're laughing, they're giggling, you guys are having a good time, but thinking about this in the level of detail we should be, if you have 30 years superior equipment and all of this knowledge, and you are only able to get just about the result that Dr. Vogel did with 30-year inferior equipment, something here is wrong, sir. I wouldn't be too excited. I mean, that's pretty sad. I mean, think about it. I mean, you're talking about a mass amount of detailed differences with the technology 30 years prior to where you were in 2012. Very interesting.
Right, so the element may not be exactly the very strange, hardly synthesized, advanced technology thulium, but aluminum. Aluminum. Right, with silver, all right? It's got a little bit of silver on it, right? And so the scientific explanation, if you like to call it like that, is that they both have thulium and aluminum have a strong band at the low energy level, which is 1.486 kilo electron volts, and thulium is 1.462, and the computer misses that all the time. So when somebody has experience with EDS, they say, wait a minute, it could be something else. And this happens all the time, by the way. And this is our job as a spectroscopist to figure it out what other possibilities we have. So now we have just about, I mean, I submit to you two very equal or very, very look-alike plots. And I say on one side is a very strangely made thulium, and on the other side is aluminum.
Once again, Dr. Alvarado, which system misses this all the time? You stated that computers miss this all the time. Are you talking about your 30-year superior technology to Dr. Vogel's computer? Or are we talking about Dr. Vogel's computer when he took the original sample? I believe the audience should hear that. I believe also that if we're going to discuss this, you should be able to present this in a fashion that everybody understands it and not try to flex so much and go into details that no one is understanding. You put things on the screen here that most people won't read, because if they do read, and I'm sure you're aware of it, they won't understand what they're reading. So if you're really trying to relate and show that you want to make everyone clear on the presentation that you're performing, you would try to keep things in very basic analogies that everyone understands, because not everybody is an expert in your field.
And everything is normal, right? So, but of course, nobody knows about this, because what I have to do if I want to perpetrate this deception, and I could probably do it right now, because I don't know how many people understand EDS analysis, and I can tell you, oh yes, this is thulium. I got another sample from Meyer, and yes, I confirmed this. Now, the extent of what somebody else can reproduce this, that's questionable, because you probably need access to fairly expensive equipment. And not just that, you're going to be trained on it. And that is something that is not easy to have for regular public. So you can see the extent of the deception in this case. Now, just real quick, I went ahead and turned my system a little bit, and voila, I got thulium myself. So you can see the computer now is telling me that I got thulium out of my aluminum sample, just by playing with my system.
Did you catch it? I'm speaking of the illustration with the text beneath it. Did you read the text carefully? And the reason I say that is because Dr. Alvarado is not going to bring it to your attention, as he didn't bring it to the attention of the audience that was present that day. He was too busy trying to pursue the deception of Dr. Vogel when he analyzed the sample to become either rich or famous, or both, through this documentary, and throw away an entire career that was prestigious. What we see here is it states the system used here is 30 years more advanced than that used by Vogel. Now, guys, I once again want to reiterate, I have no idea of any of what these two gentlemen were analyzing. That's not my profession. But I can critique on logic. And logic states that anything dealing with science, as an engineer myself, that we would always utilize the same exact equipment. We wouldn't use equipment that is different, let alone 30 years superior to the equipment used originally. Dr. Vogel didn't have that option. This gentleman shouldn't either. And then to say these words just about when he's dealing with both samples, I really don't think we need to go any deeper than that. If you weren't able to recreate the exact samples 30 years after using far superior equipment to a gentleman carrying over 30 patents with a highly decorated background, more so than Dr. Alvarado, I think that states a lot. And I'm wondering, like many of you, had Dr. Alvarado actually used the equipment that Dr. Vogel did, would he have even come close to the sample presentation that he did here? We'll never know. We'll never know if Dr. Alvarado actually had a notary or someone that was standing by as these samples were being done by himself to make sure that no funny business was taking place. Because, of course, he wouldn't lie to the audience. But he certainly doesn't have a problem not telling the audience everything. Which, once again, this is a very, very, very big detail he left out. And you can tell that the audience didn't catch it, because if they did, I think there would have been more logical responses like, hey, how come you're using 30 years superior equipment to the doctor that originally analyzed the sample? That's a logical question. So as we go through the rest of the video, keep that in mind.
Settings and all that. So it's not easy. I mean, it's very easy for a computer to really mistake elements. And I also have thulium with missing bands. So I could have made the same claims myself out of something common. I'm going to skip a couple of them. right? So what do you need to do to perpetrate a scientific deception? First, find a willing scientist or professional. That sounds hard, but it may not be that hard, right? Now, the one thing that is hard is that that professional must have access to sophisticated scientific equipment. So that may not be an easy one. And just make the scientist communicate what I call ignorant amazement, which is, I've never seen anything like this before, cannot put together myself, impossible to make with today's technology, etc. And then I spend the rest of my time just flashing my scientific credentials to everybody, my patents and all that. And all I'm going to do is talk speculation and never discuss the specifics of the data.
This is where I really get confused. We just heard Dr. Vogel's analysis of the sample where he covered nothing but the specifics of the data. It's also interesting to point out that Dr. Alvarado is bringing up speculation. I don't feel that speculation was really ever brought up other than Dr. Vogel expressing that he sees things he's not used to seeing, which I think any relative normal logical scientist would express if that's what he's seeing. It's also super interesting out of his bullet point presentation that he forgets to put in the most critical piece to what a scientist or any man of science would have to do, a professional, in order to want to go through with creating some type of hoax at this level. They would have to be willing to throw their entire career away if anyone found out or could justify that they were creating a hoax. Now, that's a very, very, very heavy credential to throw away when you have the background of Dr. Vogel. Of course, it's possible, but is it likely?
Right. So some conclusions. The metals have nothing extraordinary about it, and we don't need more samples from Mr. Meyer. I think we already know what's going on here.
Now let's review the rest of Dr. Vogel's analyzation, and what we can see here is the graph that was being discussed by Dr. Alvarado. And you will hear word for word exactly what Dr. Vogel actually said, and you can make the determination once and for all for yourself on how much speculation and how he's trying to deceive everybody, and of course, how much of the data is not being covered in specifics.
Now, the remarkable thing that we noticed was that, yes, we got this band here. This was the only one that matched in the spectral analysis in the computer, but the secondary bands that are connected with it were not present, which meant that it was a very pure metal, but the secondary emissions were not present.
The fifth stage of development, this is sample number 6, mounted in a whitish plastic, which they were used in the final development of the spacecraft. The indentation marks are Vickers indentation hardness measurements that were made before in this specimen. We will see these as we go up in magnification. To give you an idea of the size of the specimen, I will put a marker for identification and measurement purposes. We have now in the field of view a metric scale. Each line is 1 millimeter in division. So we see that this specimen is 1, 2, 3, 4 millimeters across, and about the equivalent size in the other dimension. Let us go now to a higher magnification and observe what this specimen looks like. Using now a 4x objective giving around 50 some odd diameters magnification, we can see the marks of the Vickers indentation.
Just to clarify, what Dr. Vogel is discussing is the Vickers hardness test. This test is performed by many different scientists to see what hardness the metal is that they're working with. And again, I put the definition on screen for you all to review to catch you up.
Showing a typical example of a metal. These markings were made in Zurich, Switzerland, and you can see the swell marks of the material as it is being pushed out by the diamond indenter. The surface was not highly polished, so one has now the marking of.
So if this sample had marks made on it already in Zurich, Switzerland, that would naturally mean that there are other people in on this hoax as well. And this is an area of detail that we should all focus on, because the longer this story is out there, and I've said this in the beginning of the video, and the more data that comes out behind the story, more evidence, the more evidence that can be manipulated. But it doesn't change the fact that there is a lot of people involved in this hoax, if it is indeed a hoax. And I think that's, again, what makes this so interesting is now we are talking about Zurich, Switzerland performing a Vickers test on this sample. We really have to know how deep down the rabbit hole of a hoax this would actually be. I mean, then whoever performed that test, they were apparently in on the hoax as well, to make these marks and to make them so that when Dr. Vogel would have his sample, they'd be present. I mean, think about what we're saying logically. Another very interesting fact is Dr. Alvarado went on and on about how Dr. Vogel was trying to implement his hoax. He went in with bullet points to go into great detail to his audience of why a man would do this and what he would be required of him to do it. But he never mentioned a detail about the Vickers test ever being performed. And we would be foolish to assume that naturally Dr. Alvarado never saw this documentary. Wouldn't make sense. So one has to wonder what data from this Vickers test was acquired that would potentially affect the analyzation.
The polishing equipment. There are still occlusions in the material. In the specimen I examined previously, one would get a combination of crystalline deposits and metals. This one now is more completely metal. This is the next stage after the previous one, number 6. One can see now a much more precise evidence of a metal. We'll rotate the Wallenstein prism to bring out again. Here are structures. These are structures now that would not be seen normally except with the skill of this type of development. These are areas of higher reflectivity. These are structures that are present here. One has seen this by shifting a prism. I'm going to do it again. There it is. These bear investigation. There are things beyond that which are just looked at with ordinary light. Here we can see with the power of a television camera. This is the information that we should be looking at. Okay, we'll move on. This specimen was taken the first late summer last year, 1977 specimen of the metal from the spacecraft. This apparently was the one that disintegrated, and now we'll look at it. This is polarized light at higher magnification. The exciting thing about this specimen is you can see the various discrete agglomerates of metal, 2 distinct states, one here and another one in the more uniform polished background. These materials yet are not fused together, and one can see them even more critically by rotating the Wallenstein prism. Here's the edge of the specimen where it is molded in. one sees two distinct materials. Now we will go to polarized light to see if these materials are birefringent. Now under polarized light, one sees the distinct birefringent bits of material that are present against a matrix.
Unfortunately, due to the filming at that time, the images now up for the next 2 minutes are pretty dark. So that being said, I still recommend you guys listen to the analyzation of Dr. Vogel. The main reason I say that is it gives you direct contrast of what Dr. Alvarado claimed in terms of Dr. Vogel making this some sort of extraordinary find and he was just over the moon as far as making things extravagant. We're not really hearing that here. We're hearing a scientist review a sample in the best way he could and again giving his honest review. That being said, after this 2 minutes of dark area of the video, it will come into clarity and he'll continue with the sample.
Which is non-birefringent. I'll remove the analyzer. One can see this. And when one brings the analyzer in, one can see this and has the polars crossed, one gets a birefringent area. One can be totally misled if one did an analysis of this in a gross way. One has to analyze now each of these areas. We see here the distinct birefringent areas with the polars crossed. Now I'll pull the analyzer out. One can see them, but much more distinctly that there is a birefringent area. This is number 1 sample, and as we go from 1, 4, 5, and 6, one sees a progression of diffusion of this birefringent material into the non-birefringent area. We must now analyze this material in this number 1 sample and move in the step-by-step evolution of this material into the final form that they have. It is very interesting to follow this, and one has to work now at this microscopic level. We are here now at about 160 diameters. These particles are very small, and one must deal with this on a microscopic basis. This is the end of the section now on the metals and metal samples that were given to me for examination. I was going to share these results with one of the people from NASA, Ames Research Center, a Dr. Richard F. Haynes. I had put the specimen away in this plastic envelope, which I have here, and when I took the envelope out of my pocket and went to share it with him, the specimen was no longer present. It had disappeared. I retraced my steps, checked with Dr. Wee, my wife, everything. I had 2 of the specimens fitted together this way. There were 3 of them all together in my pocket. And at this time, I no longer...
All right, this is where mine, as well as many of your BS meters, go off. How does this scientist, with such a thorough analyzation of these samples, with that level of detail, lose these samples? Or just can't find them? If anything, I would say out of everything we just reviewed, in my personal opinion, this is where the BS starts. I do not believe for a minute, like many of you, these samples just vanished. Now, there is speculation that Mr. Meyer claimed that the plagiarists took back their metal samples. Possible. Did it come from Billy himself? No, it didn't. And like many parts of this story, if you really go into detail with it, you're going to find that a lot of third-party sources speak for Billy. And that's where the problem lies. Because, of course, if you're trying to make this story more outrageous or change certain parts, the easiest way to do that is formulate a misinformation campaign by just incorporating more and more people to basically regurgitate what somebody else said in third person, and you screw the entire story up. It's real simple. We've seen it done before.
Had any additional this specimen?
Before we go to the another specimen, what is your opinion about the disappeared metal or materials?
Whatever it is.
Is it normal? Normally, is it exist well on the Earth, on our world, or?
I've had this happen before to me, and when I've worked with crystals like this,
Yes.
I'd work with a crystal, study it, as I have over the last 10 years, and suddenly the next day I go to reach for it and it will be gone. It will have disappeared. I first accused myself of being negligent and not paying attention. And finally I just put it aside. I said, if it happens, it happens. I won't let it bother me. I don't know how to explain it. I have no way of giving any rational explanation. And at this moment I must categorize it as a mystery.
I see. And what is your result of the
Of this here?
Of this material?
Right now,
Yes.
I could not explain the type of material that I have and its discreteness by any known combination of materials. I could not put it together myself as a scientist. To get a combination of thorium, silver, and silicon in discrete areas. Yes, if I were to melt it together, I would see the evidence of all of it. But their discreteness is what intrigues me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because you see, if I were to take these combinations and put it into a furnace, melt it, then pour it out and pull a little ingot, I would see all of these elements present there in any one area. But I don't. I see this discrete bits of material. Now, it can only happen by some form of a cold.
Now you're going to hear Dr. Vogel explain how he feels this sample came to be, what its origin is. And what's interesting, and I ask all of you to pay close attention to the way that Dr. Alvarado described how this man portrayed everything and what you're actually hearing. I want you to see if what you're hearing sounds completely outrageous, because as far as I'm concerned, this part of the story seems completely legit as far as what his findings are and his relative behavior to them.
Fusion process where you have the elements present and you fuse them together so they still maintain their identity, but they interpenetrate into one another.
So in other words, do you think there is a possibility to find naturally on this earth we can
Something like
find?
that. I'm going to look. I'm intrigued now. This is the type of thing I enjoy doing and dealing with, but it's also a challenge because I showed it to one of my friends who was a metallurgist, and he shook his head. He said, I don't see how it can be put together. And that's the way we are right now. And I think it's important that those of us who are in the scientific world sit down and do some serious study on these things instead of putting it off as figments of people's imagination. I respect Mr. Stevens and the people I have met. I respect their integrity. I'm doing this with no attempt, no desire for any form of remuneration. I want to know, I want to see. And that's the only reason that I'm digging into it. If it's to be a business or as part of a corporation, I'm doing this independent of IBM.
So in other words, could I say this material is extraterrestrial?
It doesn't look like anything that we've made here. At this moment, I would feel very much inclined to accept what was given to me as being true.
I see. So as a result of your whole experiment, what is your opinion about those materials?
think we must start working on a dedicated basis to look at these things and find out why we are given these grouping of specimens. I respect the people I've met so far, their integrity, their willingness to work. Mr. Della Tosa, in his work on photography, and Mr. Stevens, the way he has done his best to give me specimens. We have all done this for one thing, to serve and to find out what truth there is to this. I understand you have visited the individual, Mr. Myers, who has been given these specimens. Mm-hmm. What is your feeling about him?
Well, he's an honest man, and you know, he's living a very simple way.
It's interesting, we got to hear Dr. Vogel ask the Japanese director of the documentary when he performed it on Billy what he thought of Billy Meyer. And he said he's an honest man and he lives a simple life. It's really, really critical to think about America back when this documentary was shot. And the reason I say that is it was a much different place. People at that time had a different level of integrity, and I think many Americans out there will agree with what I'm saying. Lying was very, very frowned upon, and it wasn't as openly done, or embellishment was not as prevalent as we see today. We see it all over the internet, we see it all over the news, we see it everywhere. There's always someone telling you something, and usually it's maybe 10%, 15% truth, and it may not be the whole thing. So when we hear people talk back then and discuss something of this gravity and of this wide a spectrum, now we look back and we have to really take into account what we know today. And this is where I would ask Dr. Alvarado, if knowing that the American government has denied any type of UFOs for the last 50 years, up until recently, where we basically found out that the Pentagon released numerous footage of these UAPs and how UFOs have basically been here for an extended period of time, on top of people coming forward, like David Grush, speaking here at the opening of the UAP hearing. Dr. Alvarado, I have a question that I feel many in my audience, like myself, would like you to answer. Do you still feel UFOs don't exist? Because you must. Or you would actually change or potentially change your outcome of what was actually submitted by Dr. Vogel in his analysis. Because now that we are starting to understand some truth, that the government is coming forward that these craft obviously exist, then one would have to say it's not so crazy anymore, as the way you made it sound, that a metal sample may have been of extraterrestrial origin. You yourself never analyzed the actual sample because, as Dr. Vogel stated, it disappeared. You simply tried to recreate the exact analysis that Dr. Vogel did. And with 30-year newer equipment, sir, you weren't able to do it. You got close, but you didn't do it. So the real question is, what do you say today? I'm curious. And to wrap that up, I want you all to hear the remaining radio show of Dr. Vogel's analysis when speaking about the sample.
An orange-red deposit. I was watching that and photographing it simultaneously.
I asked Dr. Vogel if he thought Billy Meyer could be trying to fool him.
He was giving me a sample which contains chromium would have been absolutely out of the ordinary, because the metal chromium is a rare earth metal, and you would have to be really knowledgeable in chemistry to get this. If you want to build a sample, from a standpoint of taking, you wouldn't have that type of knowledge. We've got about 6 scientists now, one from SRI, another one from Ames Research Laboratory. There are 2 from Ames, and one is from GE, the
energy area. There are two from IBM. And we formed a group. There's about 7 of us. We meet now every 2 weeks, and we're digging into this with all of our skills.